So I'm really delighted today to introduce our speaker for the February University Religious Forum. I've known Elliot Barkey for a long time and consider him a friend. I also think he qualifies as one of the most interesting men on campus. I guess I should have, what is it, Dos Equis? Is that the fair that that's the most interesting man? So, but at any rate, I'm always delighted when he agrees to do one of these presentations because I always find what he says interesting and important. And I don't think today will be any exception. Dr. Barkey is an associate professor with the political science department here at IPFW. He's been here 28 years. He did all of his undergraduate and graduate work at Rutgers University in New York, or his PhD there.
New Jersey.
New Jersey, sorry.
Don't.
Sorry. Sorry. New Jersey. I hit a nerve there. I know New Jersey people don't want to be confused with the state of New York. But he and his family now live in Chicago, and he's on campus a few days each week to teach classes, but also very involved in state government. We were just talking about the fact that he's helping to get a law through the state legislature right now, and of course has been involved in the past in doing that too. So not only teaches political science, but practices it as well. And he's also Jewish, which is the reason why, and is teaching a class called The Holocaust and the Jewish Question. Or is it the Jewish Question and the Holocaust?
That's less important than whether I'm from New Jersey or New York.
I can't even, I didn't even grab a flyer, so I don't even know what I entitled the lecture. But it's one of those two, and so he's going to talk about that today. So without any further delay, let me introduce Dr. Elliot Barkey.
Okay, now it would have been more interesting if you did have a beer for me, but it'll have to do with water. So the first thing I want to do is to thank Dean Blakemore and Vice Chancellor Drummond and my department for this research support I received to take a trip to Europe over the summer. I went to a number of cities, and the research project, which is part of a larger project, is called The Jewish Question and the Post-Holocaust. So the reason that's interesting is because some of you may know, maybe you all know, that Jewish life in Europe is now more imperiled than it's ever been since the end of the Holocaust. Many Jews are being forced to leave Europe in safety, fear of safety for their lives. Many of the places I went to England, Poland, Italy, Hungary, France, many cities, and many of the places that I went to, I couldn't walk around with this on my head, which in the past was not a problem. But now it is a problem. But it's also becoming more and more of a problem in the United States, especially on college campuses, believe it or not. So there is a contemporary part to it, but what I'm going to talk mostly about is the Jewish question and the Holocaust, dealing with why the Jewish question is important for the Holocaust. And you might think that's a strange question to ask, why the Jewish question is important to the Holocaust. But the way the Holocaust is often taught, perhaps usually taught, I think really undermines the significance of the Holocaust. So normally when people talk about the Holocaust and they say, why are we talking about the Holocaust? The reason given is, so if people understand the great tragedy of the Holocaust, then perhaps it will never happen again. And so, you know, being an American, although I was born in another country, even though I grew up in New Jersey, I was born in Brooklyn. Being an American, if one was going to try to learn a lesson, I think we'd be better off talking about African Americans, the history of African Americans, Native Americans, because for the United States, that's a much more serious tragedy. Not that I didn't suffer serious anti-Semitism growing up. I was beaten up regularly as a kid growing up, and I've faced various incidents of anti-Semitism, including on this campus, by the way. But to say that we can learn from it by looking at the horror of what happened, I don't think that's real. I don't think so. There are better examples. And even though 6 million Jews roughly were murdered, 1/3 of the Jewish population in the Holocaust, if you look at percentages, there are more Armenians murdered in terms of the genocide than there were Jews as a percentage. And, you know, it's stupid to get involved in a percentage game, or Cambodians in Cambodia. And moreover, you know, most people may know a little bit about the genocides that took place in Rwanda, but there are other places in Africa where it's still going on, even more serious than what took place in Rwanda, in the Congo. I mean, it's just amazing. People don't know about it. And you might even say it's almost as if, well, it's black people getting killed, black people killing black people, maybe it's not such a problem. But I reject that entirely. Human beings are human beings. And what often gets lost is what's specific. For example, I personally am offended when somebody says, why should we talk about Black Lives Mattering when all lives matter? Well, that's a silly thing to say. Of course all lives matter, but the experience of African Americans in the United States to this day is different. You know, I don't have to worry. I may have to worry about some college campuses walking around like this, but I don't have to worry about going into Macy's and having somebody follow me around because of the color of my skin, even if I look like a professional. Well, not that I do. But maybe a professor, but not a professional. So why the Jewish question? What do I mean by that? And to say that, I want to say that when Ben is going, of course, as you said, to Bulgaria to work with Roma, with gypsies, and that's a very important thing to do. And everybody knows that gypsies were the target also of the Nazis, but nothing like the Jews. And so I also don't appreciate when people say the gypsies or the gays or the communists. I appreciate the importance of what happens to all people, but it's not the same. And it's not in terms of measuring the value of each life. In part, it's an intellectual issue. Gypsies were regarded by the Nazis as vermin, to be eradicated. And that's about the extent of it. Jews were not vermin. Jews were the cause of all other vermin, so to speak. There was something unusual about the Jews for the Nazis. Gays and lesbians, if you were gay and you got caught being gay or a lesbian, the Nazis told you to stop it. They thought that that's something, a condition could be changed. And in fact, one of the top Holocaust historians on racism, who happens to be gay, went and did some of the original research on this and discovered that in many instances that people who were gay that were arrested were told, just change your behavior and we'll let you go. And that was it. And many of the people that ended up in camps were people who had also been convicted of crimes who happened to be gay. So it's not the same thing. So what is then, what is the difference? What is the Jewish question? And I think that the way to begin to answer the Jewish question is to take a look at Nazi ideology. And in a nutshell, Nazi ideology is ein Volk, one people, ein Reich, one nation or empire, ein Führer. One people, one nation, one leader. And Nazism is not Christian, it's pagan. And if you're familiar with Leni Riefenstahl and her movie about Hitler, the imagery is always pagan. Nazi symbol, pagan. And what they're doing in that is turning the state into God. The state is God. There's no distinction in that sense between religion and politics, as there is no distinction in any totalitarian system. It's one organic whole of which everybody is a part, or if you don't play the parts, you don't fit in, you're out. And very often, that means you're dead. So what is it about the Jews that distinguishes Jews from gypsies, gays, or anything else? All right, so gypsies are out. If you're acting in a gay manner, you're out. But Jews are different because the Jewish question is responsible in this sense for all the troubles, all the trauma of history. There's something unique about the Jews, and that uniqueness has to do with what I call a theological political problem. And the Jewish contribution in history to the political theological problem really underlays the whole approach of the Nazis and challenges their notion that the state is divine. The Nazis, of course, talked about the Jews as a race. So sometimes we're inclined to think of the Nazi hatred of the Jews as racial biology. In fact, Hitler was really contemptuous of Christian anti-Semitism. He thought it was foolish, unscientific. And his concept of race, though, again, it's not just a matter of color and biology and everything that goes within that sense. His idea of race, when it comes to the Jews, has, as you'll see in a moment, a political theological foundation. So what do I mean by that? So I'm going to identify 4 characteristics of what I mean by the political theological foundation of Jews, Judaism, and why it's important for Hitler and for the history of anti-Jewish beliefs and practices. So the first thing should be obvious, and that's the idea of one God that stands outside of nature and as a creator. And that idea has huge political consequences. And the reason is because in antiquity, if you're familiar with antiquity, which is really what I do, it's not only that I'm a political scientist in my academic work, I study mostly people who've been dead for a long time. I feel it's political philosophy. And if you look into antiquity, the gods are the gods of the city. They're political, religious gods. You can't separate antiquity, in many places in the world today, religion from politics, religious authority from political authority. And even if they're separate and distinct, one is often subordinated to another. So the idea of one universal God that created everything that exists and is a God of all humanity is a threat. It's a potential threat to the political authorities in antiquity. Now, it doesn't mean it becomes a threat because there are other components to this. And in fact, Jews lived in antiquity, even in exile after the destruction of the temple, both times, the first and second temples, and the exile of the Jews. For example, Jews lived in Persia for a long time fairly well. They lived in antiquity in Greece fairly well for a long time. And so we know from the writings that they understood that the Jews have one God, and that makes them distinct, and sometimes becomes a political problem, but not necessarily. So we have to see what else turns that belief in one God into a political challenge, into a political problem. And the second component of the political theological problem is the notion that the Jewish people, according to the Jewish tradition, is a distinct holy people, separate and distinct. In fact, the word Kodesh in Hebrew means separate and distinct. That's what it means. It means set apart. And so it's a separate people and distinct. For example, if we go to the classic location of the text, that's Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham gets the blessing that the world will be blessed through him and his seed, and those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. But to show you the significance of that, in Christian theology, in the literature of the church fathers, even in this scripture itself, it will sometimes talking about the Jews being descended from Ishmael. And the reason that becomes an important argument in the early church is because Jews are said to be not really a holy people, but a cursed people for adhering to the law. And so therefore, really, Abraham is the first Christian. And following from Abraham is Isaac. This is in Augustine, but I can show you many other places in the church fathers where that's stated. And of course, in Islam, the same thing would be said, that except insofar as Ishmael is the first, or Abraham is the first Muslim, and then followed by Ishmael. And the Jewish claim of inheriting the blessing is because the Torah falsifies what really happened. So all three religions claim the same thing, that they're holy, and all three religions believe that they are the key to bringing, or let's say repairing the breach caused by what happened in the Garden of Eden. In other words, bringing about salvation. All three religions claim that. And in this sense, Christianity and Islam are irrelevant to Judaism, but Judaism is not irrelevant to Christianity and Islam, because it's still got to go back to the original claim, although, or even say that that claim came later on or was falsified. So the first point, again, just to review, is the idea of one God who created nature, who is a God of all peoples. Secondly, the notion that there's one people separate and distinct that's chosen to repair the breach in the world. And then the third point is that essential for the Jewish tradition, and this is very difficult to understand anywhere in America today, including Fort Wayne, but the essential teaching of the tradition is law, adherence to the law. And so while most American Jews don't adhere to the law, that is essential to the tradition until very recently, in modern times. And in fact, when the other modern Jewish movements were started, they explicitly said that they were breaking with the tradition in that regard. Now they claim they're not breaking, but it was always understood to be a break with the tradition. What do I mean by the Jewish law? Not 10 commandments. There are not 10 commandments in Jewish scripture. There are 613 commandments that regulate every aspect of life. So when my wife bought me this nice sweater, this might have come from my mother, I'm not sure. I better get that straight. This is a terrible conundrum for Jews, wives and mothers. And anyway, we share that with Italians and other people as well. But in any case, I have to make sure that there's no shotness in it. There's no mixture of wool and linen, because it's a serious sin to wear a garment that has wool if it's mixed with linen. And the reason is because the Bible says you can't do it. So if the Bible says you can't do it and you're serious about it, you can't do it. I can't put on a wool garment, can't wear a wool garment unless I know that it doesn't have linen in it. You follow? And every aspect of life is regulated by these 613 laws. And in that sense, Judaism, the Jewish tradition, is much closer to Islam. Halakha and Sharia are much closer than either are to Christianity, since that is so central to it. So the third point, again, is the law, and the law connects Jews to God on the one hand, worship God through practicing the law, but it also connects us with other people. So for example, I can't eat the pizza. The only thing I could take here is water. There's no restaurant. I think the closest restaurant for me is probably Chicago. There may be something in South Bend. So that creates social problems. All right? If there's a departmental event or university event on a Friday or Saturday, I can't go, you see. Just no way. And it's uncomfortable for me to go to an event when there's no food that I can eat and everybody's enjoying themselves, as you can imagine. So, but I do have water here, so I'm thankful for that, although I would have, again, preferred next time beer, the Dos Equis, please. Okay. So the fourth point that's essential for understanding the political theological problem is there is an ideal regime in the Jewish tradition, and the ideal regime is kingship. And it's not kingship in the city of God, but it's real kingship in Israel, in the land of Israel, centered in the city of Jerusalem. And so there is an ideal, a political ideal, that was brought to an end in one sense in the first exile by the Babylonians, and then again in the second exile by the Romans. But Jews live, that is, Jews who adhere to the tradition, in anticipation of the coming of the king. And the king, Mashiach, in English, Messiah, is a human king, a human person sent by God. So in that sense, you have to understand that modern Zionism is a rejection, in that sense, of the older religious tradition. Now I'm a Zionist. I'm a big supporter of Israel, and the laws that I'm working on have to do with the defense of Israel. But the truth is from a theological perspective, there are certain fundamental problems with Zionism if you claim that human beings on their own, Jews on their own, can reestablish the Davidic dynasty. So for example, if you might read in the news about all the trouble caused by Jews going up on the Temple Mount to worship, no religious Jew will go on the Temple Mount. Almost nobody goes up there if you're there. And all the rabbis have said you're not allowed to go up there because for two reasons. Number one, the ground is too holy to walk on. And we're not in a state of purity yet that can allow us to go up there. So it's kind of funny that becomes a big issue in the media. So there are people that go up there. In fact, there are people who claim to be religious, but they have the support of no major rabbis, of which there are many. And then the other thing, even if you could go up there and it's going to promote violence, you wouldn't go up there because that's a wrong thing to do. Even if we say this is ours, we would not go up there for those two reasons, you see. But that is because, and that's relevant to that fourth point, while kingship is the ideal regime, we recognize since the destruction by the Romans of the Second Temple that we live in exile. So it's very important to get straight. I'm from New Jersey. Well, now the truth of the matter is we tell our family and relatives back in New York and New Jersey that we're really Hoosiers because we much prefer Hoosiers than that, but don't tell anybody else. I told you this. We must prefer the Midwestern way of life. But you know, just as it's important to understand that that although I was born in another country, Brooklyn, and grew up in New Jersey, and now I'm a Hoosier, the real homeland of a Jew is not the United States, as it shouldn't be for a Christian either, by the way. But that's, since it's America, everybody's entitled to their own beliefs, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But in fact, should not be, because the real homeland is not something not to be established by human beings in any country. There's an ultimate destination to which we aspire. That's not on this earth. Okay, so those 4 points together, again, one, God the Creator God; two, the establishment of the claim of a holy people; three, the law, the role of law that makes it separate and distinct or holy; and four, the idea that we're in permanent exile is essential for understanding the Jewish question in history. And I want to give you some demonstration. I'll just use, I can't take a whole semester of a class I'm teaching and collapse it into an hour, but I'll give you a few examples what I mean by that in time. So one way I want to do it is, since a lot of the writing and research I do is on Greek political thought and Greek philosophy and antiquity, is to tell you a little bit about the first Greek writer that mentions the Jews. And it's very interesting because you don't find any mention of Jews or Judaism in any of the writers that are authentic until you get to Theophrastus. And Theophrastus inherits the leadership of Lyceum from Aristotle, just to give you a time frame there, right? So we're moving towards the end of the 4th century BCE. Theophrastus is a very, very important thinker who transmits Aristotle's text and his ideas. And the way we see what Theophrastus said about the Jews actually appears, of all things, in a book by the great Neoplatonist thinker, Porphyry. And the title of the book is on abstaining from eating animals. This is the original PETA, not people for eating tasty animals, but the original argument for people for the ethical treatment of animals. And the argument that Porphyry makes is that philosophers who are truly aimed at communing with the highest God, which is an immaterial God, a permanent God, should abstain from eating animals, as they should abstain from eating everything that gives you too much pleasure. And so real philosophers, it's a complicated argument, I'm just summarizing. Real philosophers will not eat animals, and they won't sacrifice animals, and if they sacrifice animals, they won't eat animals, right? But Theophrastus, like Porphyry, has to worry that this is going to offend, that religious teaching, philosophical teaching, is going to offend the political authorities, right? And as a matter of fact, Theophrastus appears, his work is called On Piety, and it appears in Porphyry's work. And On Piety was written by Theophrastus apparently to defend himself from the charge of impiety. He was thrown out of the city, twice thrown out of the city. And as Aristotle said, his Theophrastus' teacher, sometimes you have to leave Athens so it doesn't commit a second crime against philosophy. In other words, when you challenge the gods of the city, and more importantly for the Greeks, you challenge their religious practices, it can lead to big troubles. So Theophrastus, like Porphyry's work, is a defense of philosophical practices, ideas, rituals, against the idea that their piety is destructive of political order and destructive of justice. And what's interesting is the location of Theophrastus's discussion of the Jews, and it's not very much, but what he says, as soon as he finishes saying that people who sacrifice animals to the gods, and they say they're doing it for the gods, really are covering for what they really want to do. They really want a Big Mac. Or somebody told them Baconators or something called a bacon, whatever. They're covering, they want to pleasure themselves, and so they say they're sacrificing to the gods, but it's not true. And at the end of the Theophrastus' larger excerpt in Book 2 is he says, we don't want to change the laws of the city. These practices are best for philosophers, but don't think we're trying to undermine the order of the city. But this is what philosophers should do. So where does the account of the Jews fit in? Right after he says that that sacrifice is a cover for satisfying pleasures, he says the Jews sacrifice in a way that we would all find repulsive. Because what they do is they sacrifice the animals and they burn it completely with wine and honey. They don't eat it at all. And what they do is they hang around all night, because they do the sacrifices at night, so the all-seeing, maybe the sun, depending how you translate it, won't notice what they're doing. But what they do is they discuss the divine, they study the stars, and they pray to God. This people descended from philosophers. Usually it's translated as race of philosophers. It's really people descended from philosophers. So it's a weird thing, because he's saying on the one hand that the Jews are philosophic people, which is an extraordinary thing to say, and they do what philosophers do. They study the stars, they pray to the god, they worship the god, but they also do something that's really repulsive. They don't eat the animals that they sacrifice. So some people say that, well, you know, there's a negative part, there's a positive part, so some scholars will say, well, he's not really making a judgment, he's describing it, and everything he describes, by the way, is pretty much wrong. Wherever he got it from, it's not the way it works, just so you should know. So you could say it's neutral. Some scholars will focus on the negative part, he's putting the Jews down, and others will focus on that he's praising the Jews as a race of philosophers, or a nation, or people descended from philosophers. There's a bad part, and there's a good part to it. And the reason that's so important is because in the larger context, what he's really saying, and he says in a few places elsewhere about the Jews, is that the Jews understand what's true and correct. But he says, which I didn't add on, I'm going to add on now, that they sacrifice not because they want to, but out of necessity. Out of necessity. And in Jewish literature, the argument for animal sacrifice very often is, it's a way of weaning the Jewish people away from idol worship. In fact, there's no word in Hebrew for sacrifice. It's korban, to bring a korban, and the root of it is karev, which means to draw near to God. So the idea is that in bringing the animals, the Jewish philosophers didn't really want to do it, but they must have been compelled to do it. So what are they compelled to do it by? What's compelling them to do it? And everywhere else in the text where he's talking about that, they're compelled to do it by political needs, by satisfying the needs of the people who are Jews but who don't understand that this is not the best thing to do, and perhaps because of the political circumstances. But the Jews are different, and that's good and that's bad. Now the reason that's important is because people who do Jewish studies and do Jewish texts almost never talk about anti-Jewish things. In other words, they focus on the positive contribution of Jews and Judaism to history. And the people who do anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism only focus on the negative stuff. But the odd thing is that never the twain meets. And this is what I'm doing in my research. Because a lot of the crazy anti-Jewish charges are true, in a sense. They're based on a kernel of truth. So what do I mean by that? The Jewish idea of God is a threat. It's a threat to people, right? So, I mean, in fact, I'll have some science students or people who will say to me, do you really believe in God? Do you really, any religious person who's obviously religious has probably had to deal with that. Well, people say to you, do you really believe in one God? Isn't the God of the scriptures really a nasty, undesirable person? Or God? I mean, how can you really believe all that mumbo jumbo? You're supposed to be an educated person. You follow what I'm saying? So in the university, you know, how could you be a professor and really be religious? It doesn't make any sense. You're supposed to be rational. But in antiquity and all the ways through history, that idea of God, it could be, okay, yes, Christians accept that there is one God, but that one God is triune, right? So let's say there are three parts to it. Well, that means that the Jews really don't understand. The opening line of Genesis is Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, 7 words. It doesn't come out 7 in English, but it's important in Hebrew that it's 7 words. And the word Elokim seems to have a plural ending. So in the Christian exegetes, they said that's because in the beginning, God is really tripartite. It's 3 parts. The Jews don't get that because they're blinded by their understanding, right? So that becomes a whole anti-Jewish meme that's translated through history. But it becomes more significant when it becomes connected, not just the idea that it's one God, it becomes more significant when that one God has chosen the Jews as a holy people. Because even though Christianity says Jews originally got that, they lost it. They lost it. So for example, there was a professor brought in to the campus, Stephen Sizer, who's a very famous anti-Semite in England and in Europe. A British lord told me he couldn't believe that he was here on campus. So he's brought in, and his important work, which he didn't talk about here, I tried to get him to talk about it when he was here, is that the Jews have no claim to the land of Palestine because since Christ came and fulfilled all the promises given to the Jews have no reason to be anymore. It's classic Christian anti-Jewish anti-Semitism. It's a very interesting argument, but seemed to fit in with the arguments of some people on campus, or used to be on campus. Not here now. In any case, when you take that idea of a chosen people and add it to the law, right? Well, for Jews, what makes you holy is separate and distinct. So there's a particular people. Now, in Judaism, you should know that while Jews regard, in the tradition, not in Fort Wayne necessarily, but Jews in the tradition regard the Jews as the Am Segula, the chosen people, any human being can ascend to the world to come, to the highest places in the world to come, if you follow the 7 laws given to the descendants of Noah. So on the one hand, it's very particularistic, but it's in other respects more universal than Christianity can be at various times. So we don't encourage people to convert. We push people away who want to convert. It's not necessary. Why would you want to do all these crazy things like go to Macy's and then have to check out when you know, not just at the counter, but check out whether it has wool and linen in it. It's not necessary, right? But for Christianity, what do you do? So the claim in the scriptures, beginning with Paul and all the ways through in various ways, is that the law deadens your flesh. It deadens you to the spirit. So this is an old, again, meme for Christianity, that if you adhere to the law, then you're dead to the spirit. And in various ways in Christianity, without getting into it, because it's very complex in the tradition, how it evolves, the point is that it makes the Jews a people, and Paul's argument is twofold. One, you don't adhere to the law because the law is particular rather than universal. So that's one thing. We need something universal in Jesus. If you die to the flesh through the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that fulfills what the law set out to fulfill. It can't do it. So one thing, it's got to be universal. Second of all, is that it can't do what it claims to do. The law leaves you in the flesh and deadens you to the spirit, right? So the law now becomes something that's very, very negative, And it shows that the Jews are unsocial. They won't eat with us, they won't live with us, they won't intermarry with us, and so on and so forth. So now we've got not only the idea of one God, not only the idea of a chosen people, but a chosen people bound by law that makes them separate and distinct. Right? That's the third thing. And then the fourth thing is that since the Jews look at themselves in exile, that means they're never fully members of the country in which they lived. So I was in Poland over the summer, one of the places. There were Jews in Poland long before there was a Poland, but Jews were never considered Polish, right? You could be a Jew living in France, eat all the French toast, all the French fries, and all the things that French people don't do, but we accuse them of doing, although my son insists on calling them Liberty fries and Liberty toast. And he's even more right-wing than I am. What can you do? He wouldn't even let us have Heinz ketchup on the table during the prior presidential election. But, you know, I could eat all that stuff. I'm still not going to be French. And when I'm walking around in Paris, I have to be very careful this summer where I'm going. All right? So it's gotten much worse in Paris in the last few years, but it's never been all that good. Jews were exiled from every single country in Europe for various reasons. But the easiest way to see it is to take a look and put these various factors together. So what do I mean by that? I mentioned before that that Jews, for example, lived fairly undisturbed after the exile by the Babylonians in, just for one example, amongst the Greeks. So the famous story that everybody knows, where the Jews had troubles, maybe not anymore, is the story of the Maccabees, right? You know the story of the Maccabees? In the book of the Maccabees, which is in the Christian scriptures, not in the Jewish in any way, which is an interesting thing. In any case, the Maccabees, it works like this. Alexander comes in and conquers, just very quick, simplified history. Alexander and the Jews got along very fine. A lot of Jews name their kids Alexander. Even to this day, you find Alex in various places in Europe after Alexander the Great. All right? And then there is a series of Seleucid rulers, kings, Antiochus the first, second, third, and then you get to Antiochus the fourth. He's the villain in the Hanukkah story. And it's interesting because while Theophrastus is a student of Aristotle, who's a student of Plato, who's a student of Socrates, Antiochus has a court philosopher who's the antithesis of Plato and Aristotle, the greatest opponent of Aristotle and Plato in antiquity, and that's Epicurus. His house philosopher is a thoroughgoing materialist who wants to universalize the teaching. And Antiochus, the reason the Jews get in trouble with Antiochus is because he tries to compel the Jews to accept in the temple Greek gods, especially one that's supposed to be Zeus, but it looks a whole lot like Antiochus, his statue, right? And so now what's happened is that it becomes very bad because, yes, we could live, okay, one God, fine, we have a bunch of them. But you take one and we'll take yours. No, we're not taking any gods. Then it becomes a political issue. So that political theological problem, when your beliefs compel you to tell the Jews that they can no longer have just one God, but moreover, they have to stop circumcising, they have to stop publicly teaching the Torah, they can't keep the Sabbath, and so on and so forth. That's the problem. And that's where the war breaks out. Those are the conditions, right? Just to give you one example, you have to have certain conditions coming together, always separate and distinct, but can manage. In the case of Christianity, just to jump up, so there are anti-Jewish teachings in the scriptures, and a lot of the anti-Jewish teachings, of course, are really aimed at arguments amongst different Christian groups, even amongst the church fathers, because the church is trying to figure out what's true, what's not. Is the Trinity consubstantial, meaning is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all equal? And then in the early years, there were arguments about this. And without, again, going into all of that, a lot of the anti-Jewish rhetoric in the scriptures and the teachings of the church fathers is in part of working out inter-Christian squabbles, theological squabbles. But it still has an anti-Jewish part to it. And that becomes very, very pronounced when now you're competing for political power. So, for example, we mentioned Porphyry, for example, and other Neoplatonists. Porphyry was also famous in his day for writing tracts against Christians. Didn't like Christianity. And then there are later on Christian Neoplatonists. And when you get to Constantine, who's the first Christian emperor, one of the first things he does is to shut down all the Neoplatonist schools, pass laws that are going to impact very badly on Jews, and promote his own Neoplatonist, now Christian Neoplatonist ideas. And so now you have Christianity in power, and it's not even to say that theologically Constantine is a proper Christian ruler. I'm not even saying that. But I'm saying that when Christianity accedes to power, bad things start to happen. So when, in the fourth line of Constantine is a ruler that his name is Julian. If you ever heard of Julian, known in Christianity as Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate shuts down the Christian schools, opens up the Neoplatonist schools, and tells the Jews, I want to rebuild the temple for you. Not that the Jews even wanted it, but he offered to do it. Then he's killed, and then, then they open up the Christian schools, close down the Neoplatonist schools, and now you're into Justinian and the Justinian codes, which really start getting even more nasty. And the Theodosian codes and all these other codes and Council of Nicaea and all these subsequent councils that get more and more rigorous in the not only nasty things that they have to say about the Jews, but the nasty things that they do. But even saying that, many of the scholars who cover anti-Semitism don't realize that some of the codes that are passed by Christians are actually supported by the rabbis at that time. So there are codes, Jews can't intermarry, Jews can't eat with Christians, stuff like that. That's perfectly fine. You know, people looking down from a liberal perspective, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Some of that stuff isn't. The rabbis want it too, right? They want that separation and that distinction. But then it gets, again, bad, of course, worse. And we don't have time to go through a whole series of these things. But in the Crusades, for example, and you should know that the popes always said, you can't kill Jews, you can't murder Jews, you can't do this, you can't do that. But the problem is when you unleash those forces, and you've already demonized the people, but so for Augustine it's, the Jews are condemned, but don't kill them. We got to preserve them as a witness to the terrible things that they did. So we know we're true. Bad things are going to happen when you teach people that, So I had to deal with that as growing up in Bloomfield, New Jersey, being beaten up by Irish Catholics for killing Christ before Vatican II, whose goal in life was to go to Notre Dame, which I also taught for 19 years as an adjunct. That's God's sense of humor. The people that all beat me up regularly, there I am. And the Crusades, blood libels. The church always said blood libels are not true. That doesn't matter. The blood libels were used, and they're still being used today, but not in the Christian world. Blood libels that Jews are drinking the blood of Christian children and eating their bodies sometimes. Usually it's the blood libel charge, and Jewish communities get massacred in the Crusades and later on. As I said, exiled from every country. So the question is why? It's not just theological, it's often political, because at the same time, if you look at it, there are internecine strifes going on amongst the Christians for political power. And so then when you get to, just jump ahead again, to the advent of Protestantism, Luther's writing on the Jews, talk about vile, nasty stuff. If you ever read Luther on the Jews and their lies, where he actually says that you should burn down their synagogues and rob them of all their money and all their property and throw them out. Real nasty stuff. But if you look at the early Luther, where some people say he's not so nasty to Jews, but theologically it's really vile again from a Jewish perspective, because we don't think that we're condemned by the law, by following the law, condemned to the flesh, that we're spiritually devoid of any meaning or significance. But that's the early Luther before he starts saying really nasty things in terms of political power. So there's a whole history in Germany and elsewhere of these Lutheran teachings, which Lutherans don't teach anymore, I don't think. Most Lutherans don't even know about these writings. But really, again, creates a situation in Europe where Jews appear to be a very bad people, separate and distinct, believing in a God that's not really our God, and become a political threat, which is why they have to be exiled. The Spanish Inquisition, 1492, right? If you look at the UN 2001, I believe, Durban Conference on Racism, right? 1492 becomes the key year because that's the beginning of colonialism in the Western world and going down to Africa. And interestingly enough, in the UN protocols on this, nothing happened to the Jews in 1492, even though the biggest part of the Inquisition was, in fact, it was Jewish money that probably paid for a lot of the expeditions, because Jews were given three choices. Leave, including leave behind your money and your children, die, or convert. And all three options were tried, and not much good came out of it. Even if you converted, not much good came out of it, because that became one of the great charges. If you wanted to take down an enemy in Spain, you accused them of being a Jew, or even in Italy, you accused them of being a Jew. So because I think we should leave more time for some discussion if you would like to have it, these are just themes I wanted to trace for you, so that when we get to the Holocaust, just jumping way ahead, and this means, by the way, jumping ahead, I'll say one other thing first, liberalism, which many people thought would be a salvation for the Jews. If you read Jefferson or Mill or any of the great liberal thinkers, Jefferson, if you want to understand the Jews, you not only have to read their Old Testament, but you need to read their Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, the Zohar. He lists all these Jewish texts I was shocked that he even knew existed, which I'm sure he never read. He read it about it somewhere. But he says, and once you read all of that, you realize what a low and degraded people they are, people fit for barbarism. Same thing with John Stuart Mill. All the great liberal writers have nothing good to say about Jews and Judaism, and for a good reason, because Jews and Judaism are based on what? A law, a tradition centered on law that comes from above, and they blindly follow it, right? So it's antithetical to liberalism. So you can't be a good American. Jefferson writes to essentially what's a Reform rabbi at the time in America, expressing his view that one day all Americans will be like him, practicing the same practices of all Americans. In other words, giving up his tradition. And that's what Jefferson thinks is going to happen. Because liberalism tries, although it doesn't, it's not going to punish Jews in the same way of killing or even lesser things, but it does try to punish by compelling you to assimilate. And that, of course, becomes one of the great attempts at a solution, is assimilation. But that doesn't work either. Assimilation doesn't work. There was a book, Driving Miss Daisy, and a movie made, if you recall it, with Morgan Freeman and Jessica Tandy, was it, I think, right? It's not in the movie, but it's in the book. Morgan Freeman plays a chauffeur, and in the book she says, oh, it's based on a real bombing of a synagogue in Atlanta. That synagogue was very involved with the civil rights movement, promoting the civil rights movement. It was bombed. And so Miss Daisy says to the driver, I don't understand, why did they bomb us? We're not Orthodox. Right? In other words, we're all assimilated. Go bomb an Orthodox synagogue. It makes no sense. You know, people think you can assimilate and you can escape. That's what they thought in Germany as well. The most assimilated Jewish country, the greatest civilization of its day, interestingly enough, most enlightened of all countries. If you got a PhD in America, you were nothing if you didn't get one from Germany or go study there. In fact, it's thanks to Hitler that American universities became first rate, because he chased out so many, or tried to kill so many Jews and others who would have been put to death if they would have stayed. The point is that when you put together these 4 points that I'm making that characterize the Jewish question in civilization, when you get to Germany, it becomes a challenge to the totalitarian ideal of a people separate and distinct. No, you can't be separate and distinct. No, you can't worship a God that creates demands on all peoples. All right? It's contrary. It's the Jews, it's the Jewish people that are responsible, says Hitler and the Nazis, for capitalism. It's the Jews and the Jewish people responsible for communism. The Jews are, in other words, gypsies and gays are responsible for being disgusting. The Jews aren't only disgusting, they're responsible for everything that's wrong in history. And there's a long history to these arguments, you see. So the significance of the Jewish question for the Holocaust is an age-old question that's ignored by political historians, political theorists. And I think it's one of the most important questions that's ignored. And it's especially important now to realize it because we live in a time where who would have thought, although it's an interesting thing, when I was in Europe and I spoke to people who were Orthodox, they would say, what else is new about the rise? And it was the assimilated Jews who would say, this is terrible, we thought we were French, we thought we were British. They're the ones that don't get it. But the truth of the matter is everybody has to fear it now because it's no longer safe. So all the more reason for people to seriously think about the larger historical issues. Why the Jews? And I'll just finish with that, and we can take questions and have some discussion if you like. Okay. Any questions, comments, or complaints? Yes, sir.
I'm curious, what struck me was the title of your talk, which was interesting because no one could really figure out what exactly the title was behind. But the idea of a question, the Jewish question. I study American history, and we have the race question, we have the labor question in the time period that I studied. So I'm curious where, with the Jewish question, it seems like it's a question that goes back thousands of years. Right. Where, in your opinion, as a guy that grew up within lefty communities and the East Coast,
right,
where does the Jewish question sit with the American labor and race question? Like, where do you see that in terms of in the fabric of America? Do you see it as something that's imported from Europe, or do you see the American Jewish question as like a unique creation kind of in America?
It's different than America, like everything else is different in America. The race question in America is not the same as the race question in France, for example, or South Africa, for that matter. They're very different. So it is different, but just to give you an example. So my grandfather was on the Central Planning Committee of the Socialist Party in New York. He knew Debs, he knew Trotsky when Trotsky was in New York, and Jack Reed and all those guys, all these important communists and socialists. And he also heard his favorite speaker, although he hated his politics, was William Jennings Bryan, because he thought he was a lightweight, And my grandfather at the time was fairly assimilated. But most Jews the Jews who were most religious did not come over. So the Jews that came over that were educated in the text and so on, most of them stayed in Europe. The people that, and despite the horrible conditions, they weren't coming to America because America was, as one person who refused to come over told me, it's materialistic. I'm not coming to that country. And so they came here, but the Jewish radio station, so these people did a lot of the practices because that's what you did in those days. They kept kosher in the house, maybe not outside. They went to the synagogues Friday evening, Saturday morning, but then they went to work. It's that kind of interesting combination of trying to keep the traditions, but not realizing what they were doing, as is so often the case. But the Jewish radio station later on was WEVD. And guess what the call letters stand for? Eugene Victor Debs. Now it's Puerto Rican. It's a Puerto Rican station. But then it was a Jewish station. So, I had a lot of people that were involved in the labor movement and in political parties and so on when there were Jews, because most Jews that came over in the Jews that came to Fort Wayne were largely from Germany originally, and they were Reform Jews. And there actually was an Orthodox presence, but it's been covered up by the local historical society.
So
Denies it.
If I can package something in what you said, maybe differently than the way you'd package it, but maybe you'd agree, is that then if the profoundly religious folks stayed back in Europe and you had this kind of not quite as religious community, are they looking for a different explanation for everything then? Are you suggesting that there's a link between the Jewish population, second generation from Europe, and the leftist movement in America because there's a search for some sort of answer and they follow?
Yeah, so it's a lot. First of all, if as a historian you know or should not so much, but the French Revolution changed everything. World War I changed it even more because all the local authorities were broken down. There's all this movement around, so it was much harder. So when people romanticize Jewish life in Poland, let's say before World War II and so on, it was already very, very mixed. You see pictures, a lot of the women are not covering their hair because Jewish women are supposed to cover their hair. Their arms are showing up to their shoulders, all these things that they're not supposed to do. And they're having mixed dancing, which you're not supposed to do either. They're having a good old time. You see some of the old Yiddish movies where they're already doing that. Things already changed, and there are already fights unfolding. So there was a natural, I think, progression towards the left, but also because in Europe, if you were supporting liberty, you were against the church, right? And you were against the aristocracy. So there's all that baggage. But it's just so complex. Yeah, so there's something in the Jewish outsider thing that becomes, and there's a lot written on that, that becomes the Jewish lefty kind of thing, you know. But when you think about what happened, in terms of the Holocaust, for example, Bulgaria was one of the most anti-Semitic countries in Europe. And you know what they did to their Jews? They saved them. They killed the Macedonian Jews. They participated in that. But when Hitler said, now give us yours, no, they dispersed them through the countryside. You can't have them, right? Bonhoeffer, everybody thinks is a great Lutheran pastor, gets killed by Hitler, right? He was a raging anti-Semite, if you read his writings. And I didn't know that until a professor friend of mine from Germany said. The guy was a great guy, gave his life to save Jews and others, but the guy was a terrible anti-Semite. One of the reasons that Holland makes a big deal about Anne Frank is to cover the horrible things that they did. You know, you have liberal lands, liberal countries doing terrible things to Jews, anti-Semites saving them. There's no simple answer. And my uncle was saved by the Dutch underground too. He was an American navigator shot down. They saved his life. But the fact of the matter is 90% of the Dutch Jews ended up getting turned in and killed. So that over-answers the question, but sorry. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, sir.
It's a little bit off your subject, but you brought it up a couple of times.
I'm sorry.
Jews couldn't be liberals. And you and I have discussed in the past the book that was written about why Jews are liberals. Some stunning points in there and it goes back in the history. So on the one hand, you're
that's connected to David's question. Jews in America are liberal, overwhelmingly. Religious Jews are overwhelmingly not. Okay. Overwhelmingly not. So the same, other than African Americans, Jews are more reliably democratic than any other group of people. That's changed in the last few years. It's changing. But for religious Jews, it's not that way at all. But it's also very different because most people think evangelicals. Remember, William Jennings Bryan was a great evangelical, fought evolution. Evangelicals are not a conservative in economic policy necessarily. Mike Huckabee, Rush Limbaugh hates Mike Huckabee because Mike Huckabee thinks that to worry about the poor is important to do. Right? Most evangelicals were Democrats until the late 1980s. So people moved from the Democratic Party were evangelicals because of social issues, not economic issues so much. So what chased a lot of the religious Jews, again, were social issues, not economic issues. So the simple liberal conservative breakdown doesn't really work. It's true most Jews are liberal, and that has something to do with the past, but there's a difference between religious people who adhere to the tradition and those who don't. I don't know if that answers the question for you. Anybody else? Okay.
Well, thanks. Let's thank Dr. Farkey.
Les personnages dans mes tableaux à me voir vivre en décroché. Mes idées folles devenaient lourdes.